elections without too many bruises. I think the next few weeks will be bumpy in what I've seen referred to as we can speak through you. Sorry for that. I think there was a connectivity interruption here. Do you hear me again? Yeah? Good. Okay. Today's presenter is Dr. Nomalanga Mashinini. Dr. Mashinini is a senior lecturer in cyber law at the School of Law, Wits University. Her research focus is on the protection of image rights around the globe. She explores the interplay and conflict between AI and social media regulation and its influence on the misappropriation, falsification, and commercial exploitation of individuals' identities. She hosts a podcast called Image Rights by N. Mashinini, which is the only podcast in the world with a sole focus on image rights. You should look it up. I had a chance to do that this morning. Dr. Mashinini is a Wits Chancellor's Fellow under the 2023 cohort of the Female Academic Leaders Fellowship. She's a member of the South African AI Association and recently joined the organizing committee of the International Conference on AI Research. The title of Dr. Mashinini's presentation today is Disinformation, Misinformation, and Manipulation of Truth, Reflecting on Lessons Learned During and After the Elections. Dr. Mashinini, welcome to Arisha, and thanks for taking time to speak to us and with our community on a topic that's certainly very fresh in memory. It's a topic that I'm personally very interested in, so I'm very glad that you could join us today. Without further ado, I'll just hand over to you. We have about 50 minutes. So I'll give you time to present, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and perhaps some comments also from the audience. Over to you.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. So coming into this talk, I was a bit uneasy thinking to myself, am I going to speak on law? Am I going to speak on governance? Am I going to talk on politics? Or am I just giving a bit of everything? And it was quite difficult for me to choose what to do, but I ended up somewhat sticking to law. So I am going to be looking at a couple of laws, but it's more of an overview of different laws that deal with issues around disinformation, misinformation, and what I want to now call the manipulation of truth, reflecting on lessons learned during and after elections. So I wanted to just start by putting up a few snapshots of some things that have recently come up over the past few months and especially over the past week. So we see a lot of news, some fake, some AI generated, and the mainstream platforms that we see this coming up on is social media, particularly X, which I still prefer to call Twitter, even though Elon Musk doesn't like that. And really what struck me here was we're living in a world that is so driven by deception and manipulation that everyone has to take a defensive stance, right? You have to constantly be watching what people are publishing either in your name or impersonating you, whether you are an entity or an individual. And you have to be careful about what is going out there and how long it's been up before you actually catch what's out there. And so what you see on the screen here is just a few snapshots from images and posts on Twitter. And what you'll find is before elections, we see this particular post, right, around April. This was something that the EFF had to call out, where a post was claiming that the EFF is calling on all foreign national citizens to vote for them, seemingly as a message from Nigerians in South Africa. And the EFF called it out as fake, to say this is not our kind of post. But the thing about this kind of misinformation or disinformation, and we'll talk about the terminology just now, is if you look at what is being done here, it is not far off from the campaign that Julius was actually running about opening up Africa, allowing this one passport Africa, and really it focused on the very issue that even now commentary suggests that may have costed the EFF its election, this foreign national issue, right? But we also see during the elections days, so after the voting days, when voting counting was happening during that suspense, we also see this publication over here. So what looks like the ballot counting sheet of the IEC. And the reason why I say what looks like is that it is quite unclear to me when I look at this, whether this is real or fake, although the IEC has not really denounced this particular picture that was uploaded on X, right? So the assumption is that this is a real picture, which actually shows irregularities if you think about the way in which this kind of a voting counting sheet is supposed to be filled in, right? And this is the thing that the IEC said they would actually try and bring the officers that were in charge at that particular district to book because of the irregularities that are displayed here. But nevertheless, even after the objections were raised by many parties, the IEC still said there's no evidence of vote rigging, right? So this is the sort of thing that it's news, or is it fake news, or is it the truth, but it's been manipulated to insinuate or suggest something, right? And then we also see the Mail and Guardian on the far right, posting that this is a fake news, calling out a particular publication that seemed to have come from them, right, on the 1st of June, actually, it's a recent one, where they're calling out to say this post that the ANC has been sold for 150 million to the Oppenheimers during coalition talks is a lie. But you see, this is the sort of challenge that even media houses are having to experience today, that they have to constantly not only focus on publishing truth and so forth, but also focus on who is creating news in their name. So associating their platforms with fake news, right? But see, the other thing that's interesting about fake news is that even though the Mail and Guardian is calling this out as fake news, we don't really know whether the fake news are false or not. That's the interesting element about fake news. And really, people who publish disinformation particularly, this is what they're after, just to plant the seed in the people's minds, right? So we see that during and after elections, and even before elections, there's a lot of problems around this fake news, social media, AI stuff, right? And the reason why I mention AI is because I remember the Daily Maverick was running a program that particularly focused on getting people to understand what deepfakes are. So this fake manipulated media, right, that uses people's identities, voice cloning, for instance, to create an impression that someone may have said or done something that they did not in a realistic way, right? And so this intersection of the fake news phenomenon with social media and AI is really giving unprecedented problems. So let's talk about the terminology then, right? The terminology, what is the difference between disinformation and misinformation? Because this is something that came up with a lot of contentions, especially when the Films and Publications Board tried to deal with misinformation and disinformation in election season. And I'm relying here on the principles and guidelines for the use of digital and social media in elections in Africa. And this is something that you see published by the Association of African Election Authorities, and which the IEC has also subscribed to by even putting up this guidelines on their website. And the first thing we notice about disinformation is it has these three components, that it is referring to all forms of false, inaccurate, or misleading information, right? But that is specifically designed or presented and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. And so what you find here then is, if you think about even outside the context of elections, recently there was a deepfake of Elon Musk going around calling people to come in for investments on YouTube. That was a false deepfake advertisement. This kind of thing is captured by the terminology disinformation, the meaning of disinformation. And this is actually, I would say, a definition that is seemingly universally recognized for disinformation, right? And what we see with disinformation in comparison to misinformation is that there is an intention to deceive when it comes to disinformation. Because misinformation, on the other hand, while it also refers to false, inaccurate, and misleading information, it actually deals rather with information that is disseminated without the disseminator knowing that this is false information, which means that every one of us is susceptible to publishing misinformation, right? And that's actually one of the problems with misinformation, is that the fact that it is without the presence of intention. In other words, the person who's publishing the media does not need to be aware that the information is false. Then you commit misinformation, right? So the idea then is, when it comes to regulation, clearly disinformation gives us clear grounds for finding liability because there's intention, whereas misinformation is a gray area, whether we should actually hold people liable for that, right? Now, South African laws are sitting in what we call a hybrid system, right? A hybrid legal system, a mixed legal system, where we have a combination of laws or sources of laws that regulate human behavior and entity behavior. So while the supreme law of the land is the constitutional law that gives us constitutional rights, as a first instance, when parties want to claim for something relating to, for example, disinformation, misinformation, you do not rely directly on constitutional rights. You have to go through other laws, such as legislation, such as common law, and I particularly highlight delict and crimes, because, for instance, if you're thinking about disinformation created through deepfake publications, for instance, then one could found liability for whoever created the deepfake based on delict, based on criminal law, or sometimes based on particular legislation like the Cyber Crimes Act that prohibits the publication of malicious communications. Or if you're dealing with an organization that is captured under the Protection of Personal Information Act, you could actually go to the information regulator and lay a complaint there, or bring a claim to court, for instance, on the basis of the Protection of Personal Information Act, right? So it's a mixed system where there are different laws that could enable you to actually remedy what the rights that have been violated through disinformation and misinformation, right? So I wanted to highlight for this particular talk some of the loopholes in these laws that we experienced in the 2024 elections. And the first one has to do with the Films and Publications Act. Just by way of, I want to get a sense in the room, how many people actually read the notice that the Films and Publications Board had published regulating disinformation and misinformation? Anyone?
In this audience, probably zero. Yes.
Question, who is the film board?
Where was it published? Yeah. So for someone like who's in the legal fraternity like myself, this stuff, it's easy to know when it comes up, because obviously we subscribe to these kinds of mailing lists where we get these notices, and also in your LinkedIn circle, people are publishing it and whatnot, right? So the Films and Publications Board is a board that is created in terms of the Films and Publications Act, and it regulates media publications, amongst other things, I would say. So what the board was trying to do was to say, we are bringing criminal sanctions for the publications of misinformation and disinformation, provided that it can have harmful effects, whether psychological, mental, physical, whether it can result in incitement of violence and crimes and war, etc. Because remember, leading up to the elections this year, there was this looming danger that the media tended to talk about, that, you know, there's a danger that South Africa's elections could really result in some sort of violence, protest, and whatnot. And so this is what the Films and Publications Board was trying to mitigate through criminalizing the publication of disinformation and misinformation, right? But I'll summarize 3 issues that I had with this particular publication of the notice. Because what was part of the notice was an attempt to say all social media platforms have to report to the board what they're doing to prevent and mitigate the publication of misinformation and disinformation. And the notice actually relied on the same definitions that I've put up now for misinformation and disinformation. But the problem with this is, firstly, this board does not actually have the promising potential to call social media platforms to, because where are these social media platforms located? Where are their headquarters? Not in South Africa, right? And I remember actually just before this notice came out, another body, the Competition Commission, was doing an inquiry into social media platforms. And Elon Musk was the first to say, I'm not joining these discussions. I'm not coming to the party. Ironically, he's South African born. But the point is, we don't see our institutions having enough muscle to summon these kinds of entities to even come into talks or inquiries with them. So how was this board planning to get these guys to submit their evidence of what they're doing to combat misinformation and disinformation, right? The second problem that I had was the issue that the focus of criminalizing the publication of misleading information was on the users of social media platforms, not on the social media platforms themselves. And sometimes, as a social media user, you would know that it is very difficult sometimes to even report or get attention when you report fake news, misinformation, and whatnot, for it to be removed. Because sometimes content moderators will give you feedback and say, there's nothing wrong with this post, we're keeping it up. Right. And so if you put the focus, and from a regulatory perspective, on the users themselves, you're not really solving the problem. You're not targeting the parties who have the power to mitigate the problem. Right. And the other thing is, there was no clear distinction as to whether the criminal sanctions really applied to those who publish disinformation, in other words, the intentionally misleading stuff, or those who publish misinformation. So the publication in error, where you don't know that you've published something that is unlawful. And the issue here is, if you want to pursue criminal liability, such as fines and imprisonment for misinformation in particular, you're going to run into a problem when the MPA has to prosecute, because you're going to miss the point of having to prove one of the elements of a crime, which is intention, fault in the form of intention, right? So it was not feasible the way in which the board had actually constructed this notice. And then the other issue was, for me, when it came to deepfakes in particular, right, disinformation in the form of deepfakes in particular, if the notice of the FPP focuses too much on misinformation and disinformation that causes crimes, wars, propaganda, causes psychological harms, mental harms, and so forth, it does not really regulate the deceptiveness of that kind of mis and disinformation. Because sometimes deception does not trigger negative feelings or emotions or psychological state. Sometimes it's stuff you like to see, like the Trump deepfakes that were published earlier this year, where Donald Trump was shown with African Americans and they were all hugging and smiling because his followers were apparently trying to push a false narrative, right? So in such an instance, then that kind of disinformation is not captured by the FBP's notice, right? So it misses the point of what it's trying to regulate. I could make an example that what if days before the election, we had seen MK leader in a deep fake that could have induced people to vote because maybe he was doing something good, something valuable, right? That kind of disinformation would not have been captured by the Films and Publications Board notice. Nevertheless, way before elections, I think around about 2 to 3 weeks before elections, because of the outcry that came from the legal fraternity after this notice was published, the board retracted the notice, which means by the time we got to elections, this notice was no longer applicable, right? It no longer had some legal standing, right? They could not try and prosecute anymore, right? Which the legal community welcomed for removing this, because this was going to be a can of worms trying to prosecute anyone and everyone who publishes, especially because in our law in South Africa, we have precedent in our courts that even if you're not the initial publisher of something on social media, if you're tagged to it and you don't remove the tag, you associate with it. So you can actually be joined to a claim on that, right? So the consequences of this kind of a notice were too wide and vast and problematic. That's why it was retracted before the election stage, okay? We welcome the retraction because this was a big fumble from the FPP. Now, the other thing that is available, the other type of law or piece of source of law that is available to prosecute for issues around misinformation, disinformation, particularly this AI type of stuff with the deepfakes, is the Cybercrimes Act, right? Because the Cybercrimes Act regulates things like malicious communications where people's faces are superimposed on pornographic material, like the Taylor Swift kind of stuff that happened recently, right? It also criminalizes fraudulent deepfakes and publications, such as the Elon Musk type of stuff, where someone is induced to invest thinking that Elon Musk is the one inviting them when actually he didn't do that. It's just a deepfake showing him of calling people to invest. So the Cybercrimes Act has a range of cyber crimes that can capture these types of misinformation and disinformation. But there's always this looming question of, does the South African Police Service have the capacity to deal with cyber crimes, right? So when I come to SAPS and report that someone has published a deepfake of me on Twitter or X, are they well equipped? Do they even understand the tenets of the act as well as what deepfakes are in order for them to be able to assist me at that time? Because there have been whispers of people trying to report and then being told there's nothing we can do, right? So there is this question around capacity. And then the other loophole experienced in 2024 that I saw was, while the information regulator, who is currently the custodian or the body entrusted with making sure that the POPI is enforced, while the information regulator issued a guidance notice on misinformation and disinformation issues, right, around political party publications and processes, this was actually just released a week before elections. And at that stage, I'm thinking, if you look at when electioneering and campaigning begins, is this really effective for us to receive a notice a week before elections? Seems a little too late. But nevertheless, the notice also uses similar terminology that we saw on what is misinformation, what is disinformation, and then proceeds to guide parties on what is allowed or what is preferable, how to keep in line with the POPIA, right? So I won't get too much into the POPIA, otherwise we'll be here the whole day because it's a big fat law. But The reason why I'm highlighting these sort of loopholes is to get to this point that I want to make about how disinformation and misinformation and our alertness to those types of publications has led us to a point where there is this new rise of a different problem, which is manipulation of truth. And this is what I'm proposing, that laws that deal with disinformation and misinformation need to start thinking about, or need to start incorporating in a way. Because nowhere in these rules, guidance notes, and whatnot do we talk about manipulation of truth. Because the thing with manipulation of truth is that what is published, it's still true, right? It's still very much true. So it cannot be captured under misinformation and disinformation per se, if you take a technical and literal approach to the meanings that we've discussed now on misinformation and disinformation. But what you're dealing with here is truth when it is manipulated, truth when it also manipulates. So either the truth is manipulated or the truth manipulates people, circumstances, perceptions in any context, right? Whether the information is true or false, or whether proven to be true or false, right? So the reason why I'm talking about this sort of rise of manipulation of truth is because of something we saw happen just before elections. We saw President Ramaphosa addressing the nation. And it had been a long time since we had a family meeting in South Africa when this came up, right? And I remember that day, my sister called me and said, hey, we're having one of those family meetings again. And she said, okay, I'm going to watch it. And I was like, so busy with something on research. And I said, okay, just watch it and tell me later. So she calls me after and says, this guy just reminded us everything that they've done for the country. And I'm remembering that even during COVID, we had that relief fund, you know, and a list of things. He talked about load shedding. He sort of tugged at the hearts of South African voters that remember where we come from together, right? Yes, things have happened, but remember where we come from. And this has resulted in this outrage, particularly by the DA, which I highlight here, where they're asking for Ramaphosa to be fined, for ANC votes to be docked at 1%, and all of that, because there's an argument rising up that this was actually campaigning. It was not a typical presidential speech. Whereas on the other hand, Ramaphosa says, but I was closing off the 6th administration. So in a way, he's not lying to us that he was addressing the nation. But he's also not being honest that it wasn't campaigning. So it was truth, but it was being manipulated. And it was manipulating the people, the context, because it came just before elections. It was the Sunday before the election day, I remember. Right. So remember, this is not just any president. This is the president that we walked through the COVID-19 pandemic with. We have been conditioned that family meetings are important. That's why even South Africans started coining it family meetings, right? So this is why people all went, okay, let's watch what is he going to say. So he grabbed the nation's attention at the right time to remind us, almost like a sort of like a father figure saying, remember where we come from, right? So this was not disinformation. This was not misinformation. It wasn't false information, right? But there was some manipulation happening there. Now, I want to dissect this from a different perspective of the Electoral Act now, because the DA is actually pursuing this in the Electoral Court, if I'm not mistaken. That's actually the right court. And this prompted me to think critically about some of the things that the DA is pleading in its case. If you think about Section 87, Section 87 is one of the provisions that create a list of prohibited conduct, right? whenever we're doing elections and whatnot. And Section 87 deals with the issue of undue influence. And if you look at 87(1)(a), 2, and 3, it speaks to the fact that no person may compel or unlawfully persuade any person to vote or not to vote or not to vote for any registered party or candidate. But it also goes further when you look at 4 and 5 to speak to supporting or not supporting registered parties and candidates. So it is broad in its terms of attempting to deal with this kind of undue influence that may or may not have occurred with the presidential address. Right. And when I look at all the provisions that speak of prohibited conduct, this is the most likely provision that the DA is trying to invoke in saying this conduct by the president violates the Electoral Act, because that's the allegation here. Right. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying there's a problem even with these kinds of prohibited acts in the Electoral Act and the remedies that are suggested therefore. Because firstly, if you think about the Electoral Act, in it creating
Network, are you?
Okay, we're back. All right, sorry about that. So what I really want to unpack here is all of the stuff that we see going on with the DA's complaint. It's coming after the fact. The speech has already happened. The voters have already voted, and some of them have really been reminded that, look, when things were rife during COVID, it is this government that gave me some sum of money every month to make it through, right? And I'm looking at the request because remember in one of the pleas that the DA is putting forth, it's saying there needs to be a docking of 1% of the votes. And I'm looking at where nationally the ANC is sitting. This 1% is strategic, right? Because right now, ANC is sitting at 40.18% nationally as a final count. It's quite strategic. And also, if you take the percentage of the 6+ million votes, for instance, it translates to quite a large number, right? So my questions now are coming up as, what is the effect if the Electoral Court decides to grant this plea? Right. And you can take time to look at the Electoral Act, to look at the offenses and the penalties that are listed in Section 97 and 98. But I want to just point out that there's nowhere in the Electoral Act itself where this docking remedy is sanctioned. The Act does not actually grant this docking remedy. Instead, what the Act does is to give liability in the form of a fine or imprisonment for not more than 5 years. The fine is not limited, right? So I don't have an issue with asking for 200,000 Rand fine. I have an issue with the docking of votes, because I'm also asking myself, if we consider that the right to vote is constitutionally protected under Section 19 of the Constitution, it means this is a right that it can't be easily tampered with in any way, right? So to dock votes is sort of like saying to adult citizens in South Africa, we don't really care what choice you made. We're just going to change the outcome in the way that we deem fit. So it's a dangerous kind of remedy to grant if the Electoral Court ever decided that it's going to grant it. And I do foresee it being challenged further in the Constitutional Court. So we're likely to have another case where it starts with the Electoral Court and then eventually goes to the Constitutional Court, like what happened with the MK issue, right? So the problem also for me is this particular electoral season, what stood out a lot was political parties don't actually respect South African citizens' right to vote, which is why even when there were talks about vote rigging after the votes were being counted, the request was recount, don't declare this a free and fair election. But even though there may have been rigging, right, and the raw numbers may be false, margins don't lie when it comes to counting percentages in voters. Margins don't lie. And we saw the margins actually staying quite consistent for the most part when you compared the differences between the leading parties, right, in percentage. So even though the raw numbers may lie, the margins were likely not going to change. And I think this is why Julius was saying, I don't think this is a material issue, because even if we do recount, we may still end up with the same outcome, right? Margins don't lie. And actually, in this particular election, South Africans came out in a fresh way to speak and say, we want change. It's the first time that the ANC nationally sits at 40%, right? So there seems to be a disregard for the South African citizens' voices here. When political parties are saying, dock the votes, recount the votes, et cetera, but that's just a personal view that I have with this particular thing, right? I'm not really speaking for or against any party. I'm just concerned that if the Constitution says adult citizens may vote, meaning there is an assumption that adults can make this decision, meaning there's an assumption that adults can make this decision, then why should we even entertain politicians who want the votes to, the count to sort of change or shift to please or suit whatever purposes they want to suit, right? So I do think this is a dangerous plea to entertain, this docking of votes, because it essentially says we don't really care what you voted, and the potentially 60-something thousand votes that were cast in favor of ANC. We don't really care about that. We want remedy. But remedy can be in line with the Electoral Act to give imprisonment or a fine, simple as that, if he's found guilty of an offense, right? We need to think about it through a constitutional lens. And I'm done. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that. Thanks for the presentation. We have about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes left for questions, comments. I have some myself, but I prefer not to be the first one. So I'm going to open the floor in the room, online. You can either raise your hand online or write your question or comment in the chat and we'll pick it up. So we have 2 in the room. So let's start with those. Uncle Karen?
Thank you. First, I just want to
Speak up, speak up.
Oh, to clarify the issue, the difference, especially between misinformation and disinformation. I understand you say from disinformation perspective, there's an intent. But from, so is it something that can be aggregated from disinformation, that disinformation becomes disinformation at the stage or something like that? I just want you to clarify that.
So the one that has the clear intention is the disinformation, right? Yeah. And the one without intention is the mis. So I always, to remind myself, also always think about it as the mis is like mistake, right? There's no intention on part of the publisher to deceive with misinformation, right? So you are correct in saying there is potential for misinformation to become disinformation, because once there's been a publication proving that this is fake news, published by the deceiver, the intentional deceiver, then you republishing that, knowing that it has been called out, it's you forming an intention to deceive, because you already know now that this is false. There's no mistake now in that, right? It would be much more easy to construct the argument that there's intention to deceive if you've been made aware.
Yeah, can I ask 2 questions and then from the Simon? So I think the second issue lies with the law in terms of, I agree in this particular case, we have platforms which are used to kind of disseminate information. And like you talked about a case of using someone's like picture or voice to kind of gain from people, Elon Musk and stuff, and just things of whatever. I just want to understand, what does the law says about the platform anchoring this kind of activities? And then the last one would be, I want to focus more on something that you said in the last deck, which you talked about. Okay, no,
Okay, I think what I have to say, I don't know if it's a question or rather a comment. So my first comment is on the FPB and the notice about misinformation and disinformation. So, I mean, like many other people, I would assume that I was misinformed about disinformation and misinformation. I thought in my head, disinformation is a equivocation where you take part of the truth and spin it around. So I would say the way, because right now I feel like we're in an informational war, you know, specifically with mass media platforms. So growing up, we've heavily relied on BBC, CNN, and, you know, these big companies to provide us with information. Now, where my criticism came in was when I was very young. It was the year 2000, and things were going haywire in Zimbabwe because Mugabe had decided, you know what, out with the whites. We are not going to negotiate anymore. And what was happening on ground and what was being reported on BBC was completely different. There was reports of violence where there was no violence. Human rights abuse where there was no human rights abuse. And then this created an opportunity for people who wanted to travel overseas to cry wolf, say, the government is trying to imprison me for political reasons. And these were all lies, but as long as you had something negative to say about the government, you automatically got asylum to go to the UK or the US. And a flood of people decided, well, why sit here and suffer when I can just lie that I'm a political prisoner? I'll be taken. And a lot of people developed a resentment for Mugabe. But it was through one lens, where CNN told you what they wanted you to hear about Robert Mugabe. They never spoke of all the good stuff. It's not to be spoken about. Same way we deal with Putin. There is not a good thing allowed to be said about that man, even if there are any, because the mass media platforms are at war with that man. So now we see that again with Al Jazeera and CNN and the American and the British platforms, where when it comes to reporting what is happening in Gaza, it's what I would call disinformation, where, okay, so instead of, you say there were 200 casualties, but you're not going to explain that these are also children and women. They're not just casualties. These are fatalities that are children and women who were unarmed, who were victims of circumstance. But when you go to Al Jazeera, they will emphasize on that hey, these aren't just casualties, these aren't just stray bullets. This was an attack on children and women, and it is a war crime to attack a hospital or a school. Whereas with CNN, I feel like they will pick what they want to say. So now with social media platforms, again, we have this Facebook, aligning itself with political. I don't know, if the US decides the bad guy is
Question.
sorry,
No, because I also wouldn't give a chance. I can see there's a lot. Yeah. So if you could jump to if there's a question.
In conclusion, we are at war with mass media platforms because I feel they are indeed the harmful beings when it comes to disinformation. Apart from the social media platforms, can our laws hold CNN accountable and say what you published was wrong? Do we have that jurisdiction to do that?
So
Do you remember all the questions?
yes,
Good.
it's about they're quite similar actually. It's about ISP liability and then media houses, right? So there's a bit of a yes and a bit of a no here. And the nature or the structure of our legal system is part of the problem or maybe beneficial, depending on how you look at it. So remember how I said we're dealing with a mixed legal system. So for example, with this publication on media house platforms, right, or through media houses, while there may not be some either disinformation because there's no intention to deceive, or there's no publication of false news, right? Or there may be no misinformation because it's still not false information, even though there's no intention to deceive. There is this question around manipulation of truth when publications omit certain elements of the truth, like you mentioned with the war issue, right? That the killing of women and children in particular has a different connotation to just mass murder, right? And this kind of omission when publishing truth, because remember that publication that says X number of people have died is not a lie, right? But it omits an important fact but women and children were casualties here. This is why I'm raising the question of why aren't we also regulating manipulation of truth, right? Because remember, to omit something will always have an effect, even though the thing that you're omitting is not there. So it's either you're insinuating that this did not happen, or you're insinuating that while it happened and people know of it, we're not reporting it because it's not material. Whereas with war crimes, killing of women and children is material. So truth is manipulated there. But this is the gray area in our law, that there's no direct regulation of manipulation of truth, even though there's regulation of misinformation and disinformation with the outright stuff, right? So that question you're asking me around that is a gray area in and of itself. When it comes to liability issues of publishing misinformation and disinformation, particularly of media houses, we can always look at it through currently the lens of the Protection of Personal Information Act. Because remember, publishing by media houses can be sometimes, not always, sometimes captured under processing of personal information if there is indeed processing of information happening, right? For example, where you've got people identified in the publication, personal information identifiers in the publication, and where it cannot be justified as truth for public interest. Because remember, publication by media houses is usually for that purpose, the truth in the public's interest. So if a media house can't prove those grounds, on the basis of freedom of expression, then it cannot get away with that kind of a publication, whether you look at it through the lens of the POPIA, or even if you look at it through the lens of the common law of delict, where we deal with publications that either defame, violate privacy, violate people's identity rights, and so forth. That's why we've seen in the past where there was a publication of a 12-year-old girl's image at the beach in a bikini on a Surface magazine. The cover page had this image without her permission, right? And what happened was the freelance journalist took a picture, published it, the editor approved it, but next to it there was a caption saying, "Pure filth, see more inside," right? But really in the Surface world, pure filth meant something else. It's actually something good. It's not something bad. But people who saw that publication read it in the ordinary sense, and that triggered litigation. That publishing house actually had to pay damages, so there was remedy, because that kind of a publication violated her rights to privacy, her right to good name, her right to identity, and so forth. So there are grounds or bases for you to bring a cause of action, be it through legislation like the POPIA, if the situation is captured in the boundaries of the POPIA, or bring a claim to court on the basis of a delictual claim where you ask for compensation, a sum of money, right? So it depends on the situation. I have to give you the lawyer answer. It depends, right? It always depends. The facts sometimes have something material that causes you to have to say it is or isn't a violation of a right, or it is or isn't an offense. Does that capture your question? The question around ISP liability, right, and social media platform liability is a tricky one, because universally, even if you look at the United States of America in section 230 of their Communications Decency Act, there's some immunity granted to these platforms for them to not be liable for publications made by their users. Because remember, the social media platform creates the platform, but who's really publishing? The users, right? You and I. And they cannot be in control of every little thing that we publish. This is where this notion of immunity comes from, why they are protected or shielded by this immunity. But this is also why there's a responsibility, which is growing now over the years, for them to have content moderation tools, right? And when their content moderation tools do not pick up what is wrong, then liability can shift on them if it's proven that they were aware but still left it there, etc. Right? So that there is liability in that sense, but direct liability, no, it's actually quite difficult to find liability for ISPs.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but with your permission, I'm going to steal another 5 minutes. My excuse is we started 5 minutes late, because I can see there's three or four questions online that I think are quite interesting. So if you can go, there were two questions from Stephen, if you just scroll up. The first one, if you go up a little bit, the other way.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Great presentation. Can you perhaps comment on WhatsApp? It seems to be the main conduit, one of the main conduits of spreading messages. Is it regulated? And the second question from Stephen, I think, is related, well, potentially, I don't know. Any evidence of foreign influence online in the elections, Russia in particular? Those were the two first questions. We'll just take all four if that's okay, yeah? Then Tab was saying, thanks for the presentation. And the question was, President Ramaphosa speaking as president of the country or ANC party president? If he was speaking as the president of the country, why would the party deduct 1% of its electoral vote, as the BA seems to suggest? And then the second from Rehotofetse, this conversation could be around both dis and misinformation. Both dis and misinformation could consider the increased democratization of propaganda. So a question, I guess, would be, how do you regulate the freedoms of speech that come with these social media platforms within the context of the global south, especially with our limited ability to hold social media companies accountable? There's a bit of a mouthful, I hope you...
Yeah, I think I'll take them as I remember them. But I'm remembering now that one of the things I wanted to actually mention around media houses was I wanted to share briefly an experience I had where earlier this year, a couple of media houses had published an opinion piece that stated that South African law does not protect people's rights when it comes to deepfakes being published using your image without your permission. And when I saw the publication, I tried to contact media houses to publish a response clarifying that this is actually misinformation, that there are actually at least 4 different types of laws in South Africa that I can point to that give different remedies for this. And the media houses turned it down, particularly the ones that had published the false thing, right? So it's quite interesting when you raise this issue of we have a problem with even media platforms, right? Because I've moved into this strange dimension where I don't really trust the media houses themselves these days. I'm not sure whether our media is completely free anymore. Things have evolved in South Africa to come into a space where we have to be very careful about what we read, even in the media, especially when the media can publish such false information. Because I remember my own mother picking up that article that's incorrect. And when I said to her, put the article down, she asked me why. I explained, and then she said, oh, but that's totally opposite to what you've written about. And I said, exactly. You know, this is false information about the rights that people have, right? So what I'm highlighting with this story is the media does publish false stuff. It does publish misinformation. I'll call it misinformation because I don't think it was intentional. I think they just didn't fact check, right? So now let's talk about the WhatsApp question, because WhatsApp will fall under any legislation that deals with media publication, be it social media publication or whatnot. It will fall under that. And even WhatsApp groups are relevant for that. But then again, you always have to pinpoint what are you trying to remedy? What is the conduct that you're trying to remedy? Is it defamation, for instance, right? Or are you trying to remedy the processing of inaccurate information? Because the moment you shift from defamation into processing of inaccurate information, you're already shifting between which laws you're going to rely on to remedy the problem. So the broad answer is yes, WhatsApp can actually fall under the different forms of regulation in this mixed legal system, but it always depends on what are you trying to remedy for you to pinpoint which law is right. Because there's also the Harassment Act, you know, where you can actually request a social media platform to reveal the identity of a person who's spreading misinformation about you. You interdict them for that. There's different laws in South Africa that can address that. And then the issue of President Ramaphosa speaking as president of the country or president of a party is tricky because when he spoke, he was both. So when do you separate the 2 parts of him, as speaking as the president of a party that's running for election and speaking as the president of the country? Like I mentioned, the reason why I kept emphasizing that we are used to family meetings in South Africa is that this was not an irregular speech per se. It just so happened to fall within a time that was just before elections. But the actual nation address thing, it's ordinary in our country. We're used to having the president address us, right? And nowhere do we really hear him say, vote ANC, right? Although he reminds us of what the ANC has done, how far we've come, etc. Could they have chosen a different time, maybe after elections? Sure. Did he really need to remind us of what he reminded us then? No. Right? Because even now, we're in a state where the next administration hasn't actually officially begun, because you've got that time period where you have to establish your administration. And that's why we're still in coalition season now, coalition talks, right? So could he have done this after elections? Sure, he could have. But obviously this was strategic. Even things like signing in of laws, signing in NHI bill into law, signing in the GBB laws, it's all political at the end of the day. Yes, it's totally lawful for him to choose to sign at that time, but it has political connotations that it's been done at a certain time as part of subtle campaigning. And this is why I'm constantly going back to what I said I would like for us to think more critically about is manipulation of truth. I could even extend it to say manipulation of valid actions. Because all these actions, signing in laws, addressing the nation, are valid acts that a president is empowered to do. But the timing is key. How many years have we been crying for the GBV legislation to be passed? Right. But suddenly it happens just on time for elections. Right. So those are all issues that we need to consider. And only a court of law will be able to construct whether he was speaking as a party or as the president of the country. It is quite blurred. It's quite difficult to detect that because what you're asking is about intention. It's about the subjective state of mind of the president at the time, right? And we want to use objective factors to determine the subjective state of mind. It's quite difficult to do. And so for now, we wait to see what the court is going to say. And then any evidence of foreign influence online in elections? Currently, no, I'm not aware. There could be, but I'm currently not aware of such. And then the other one was about how do you regulate the freedoms of speech that comes with social media platforms within the context of the global South, especially with our limited ability to hold social media companies accountable? It is so difficult because another thing that one of the acts that I mentioned was the Cyber Crimes Act, right? So even if the Cyber Crimes Act can properly capture deepfake pornography, or should I call it image-based sexual abuse, which is the correct term for it that is developing now. There's always this question, and it sounds sinister, but it's an important question of, well, how will you know who the perpetrator is if they're sitting somewhere in another country? How will you even get to them? But this is why we have things like mutual assistance clauses in the Cyber Crimes Act, where states work together to try and prosecute and deal with the criminals that publish stuff cross-border, right? It's more difficult if you're pursuing a private claim, like you're claiming compensation in court, because then you're going to have this question of, well, where do I lay the claim? Do I go for a South African court? Or if the person is sitting in California, do I go all the way to California to pursue this claim? And it doesn't really help when you're trying to also claim against social media platforms, because if you look at their user agreements and their provisions on their own platforms, a lot of them assume the jurisdiction where they are. For example, Facebook, California, LinkedIn, the same. They assume that particular jurisdiction. And if you've ticked the box that you agree, you've actually entered into contract with them, right? So this is part of the problem with regulating online stuff, online abuses, that sometimes it may be a fruitless exercise. Also, when you look at how much you're going to claim compared to how much you spend trying to locate this defendant or this accused that you want to go after, it is a very difficult gap to bridge. But this is why we, like I said earlier, we have this mutual assistance clause, which is a whole talk on its own under the Cyber Crimes Act. I hope I've answered all the questions online and in the room.
I think you have. Otherwise, we might have to invite you back to talk about some other issues that came up. Dr. Mashinini, thank you so much for your presentation. Let's give everyone a short. Yeah, I think might have to come back and chase you some other time. I hope that's okay. Well, thanks to everyone for their participation. I don't think there are any urgent updates. Check for updates about iSCOP on our website. Download and read some of our working papers. We recently had a interesting visit to China, Eugenio and I, and Rosofetse. So you'll hear more about that also in the near future. The next Lunchbox event is on the 4th of July. I don't know if there's a speaker already, otherwise you'll hear more from Sibu also very soon. Thanks again to everyone, and especially our presenter. All the best, and talk to you soon.